Luke Cage has been a character that I've always considered as a staple of the Marvel Universe. At first I discovered him within the pages of Alias by Brian Michael Bendis and Michael Gaydos. The way that the characters were written provided an additional sense of humanity, as Bendis is known to do. Luke was depicted as this imposing man with impenetrable skin, yet he was kind and able to be vulnerable, transcending the stoicism of strongman archetypes. Later, I would be a massive fan of the Marvel Netflix shows, not you, Iron Fist, giving me an opportunity to see this character interact with others that I had also come to appreciate. Welcome back to Comic Krackle, I'm your host, Kirby. For the second installment of Black History Month, I wanted to look at Luke Cage's origins at creation, as well as the new origins provided by way of the Ultimate Universe for the man with bulletproof skin. And you know what else is bulletproof? This transition to a word from our sponsors. Okay, one more thing before we actually get into the video. If you want my videos early, access to the upcoming Discord channel, and behind the scenes content, consider subscribing to the newly formed Patreon for Comic Krackle. Memberships are as low as $1 per month. If you want to support the channel through other means, I also just set up a Ko-Fi account. Donations are deeply appreciated, but they are not necessary. Everything from these are going to be reinvested in the channel to make these videos better. Alright, that's enough for my pitch. Now back to the video. Luke Cage is not the first black superhero, and we need to acknowledge that first and foremost. Luke Cage wasn't created until 1972, when he first appeared in Luke Cage Hero for Hire by Archie Goodwin, Roy Thomas, John Romita Sr., George Tuska, and Billy Graham. If you want to hear the story on Billy Graham, you can click that link and listen to me dissect the life and career of the most interesting comics creator. In Marvel Comics The Untold Story, the author Sean Howe details the change in Marvel's editor-in-chief from Stan Lee to Roy Thomas. He specifically noted that Thomas was issued the mandate to diversify the comics line. As a result, Marvel would look to expand the demographics that were represented within the series that they published. The hope was to target audiences that had previously been overlooked. Now these demographics could have characters that look like them, as well as having their own independent series. No longer would these characters be relegated to a supporting cast in another character's book. Before we jump into the first issue, we do need the proper context for the inspiration behind Luke Cage. Blaxploitation is a genre of film that came to prominence in the early 1970s. Before this time, African Americans were relegated to portrayals including harmful stereotypes or background characters. During the rise of the civil rights movement, a call came for further representation of black voices within media, in front of and behind the camera. As a response, UCLA began financing its black students interested in film and gave them the tools to pursue careers within Hollywood. The genre has a negative connotation derived from the misunderstanding of intent. These films were originally created by African American filmmakers for an African American audience. They sought out to portray black characters to be equal to their white contemporaries, doing so while maintaining the tonal authenticity that came with creatives incorporating lived experience in their work. While other films helmed by black creators predated it, Sweet Sweetback's Badass Song is typically referred to as the first official blaxploitation film in 1971. Now would be the reasonable time to ask what the indicators are for a blaxploitation film. Well, fear not, dear viewer, I have you covered. Blaxploitation cinema typically included black protagonists overcoming the man, or allusions to white oppression to black communities. They would also include the use of inflammatory rhetoric or then taboo inclusions of violence, sex, and drugs in a means to elicit a reaction from the audience. The genre is notably important for its inclusion of black women in leading roles, giving autonomy over their stories while also allowing for them to maintain independence. Additionally, the genre would incorporate black liberation messaging within the films, calling for unity of African Americans to not settle for equality, but instead seeking equity. Films would also be identifiable by the utilization of soul and funk soundtracks in an effort to invoke the unfiltered aesthetic, signaling that these stories weren't diluted by corporate interference. The genre would also be explored further by the creation of films within subgenres like horror or coming of age, while maintaining the tonal continuation of blaxploitation. And I can't speak about this genre without also addressing the criticisms of it. Thought leaders within the African American community, including Alvin Toussaint, Jesse Jackson, and many others, would cast aspersions towards blaxploitation and the misuse of the opportunity to portray black protagonists in aspirational roles. With the majority of the films in the genre depicting pervasive stereotypes and generalizations of the black community, it's understandable that there came calls for concern. Now that you have the proper context, let's move to the primary inspiration for Luke Cage, Shaft. Shaft was a film that came out in 1971, directed by Gordon Parks. The film portrays a private eye by the name of John Shaft that's tasked with rescuing a Harlem mob boss's daughter after she's kidnapped by a rival gang. The movie depicts a black protagonist that's able to work outside of the law while also operating in an action hero role within the heightened realism setting. Shaft and the subsequent films within the genre were able to provide their protagonists with agency, as well as establishing them with nuances that had seldom been provided to black characters previously. Shaft in particular was a cultural phenomenon due to the ability of retaining authenticity while not placating to a white audience for acceptance. These films would be shot for a low budget and would exponentially overperform at the domestic box office. Marvel would use Shaft as the primary inspiration behind Luke Cage, while also inverting the expectations for black superheroes, specifically Black Panther. While Black Panther would be shown to be an African king leading the hidden nation of Wakanda, Luke Cage would seek to portray a grounded everyman. Issue 1 opens with an immediate subversion of expectations for a hero by utilizing its establishing shot on Seagate Penitentiary, which the narration also refers to as Little Alcatraz or Hell. Not only does the first time that we're introduced to our new hero by way of showing him as a prisoner, but it's also to showcase the brutality of the prison system. This introduction rids the reader of the preconceived notions of what makes a hero, as well as who they can attribute righteousness towards. The scene follows two prison guards outside of a prisoner's cell, with one seemingly hesitant about the amount of time that this prisoner has been subjected to solitary confinement. The other guard responds to this by saying, "Stow it, if he were really human, he'd have cracked a long time ago." When the prisoner is finally let out of the cage, the guard says to him, "I give a hard nose like you about 5 minutes outside solitary. You'll be back, and I'll be waiting, wise apple, to break ya." The issue then follows the prisoner, Lucas, as he interacts with other inmates. This is where Lucas is approached by two prisoners asking for him to join in their, quote, demonstration to set the warden straight. Lucas declines the offer and says,
"If I need a group, I'll do the organizing. But I don't need anybody or anything except out of this hellhole. And best chance of doing that is on my own."
The next scene has Lucas called to meet Captain Rackham, serving as the highest leadership position over the prison guards that isn't the warden. I want to highlight that just prior to Lucas's arrival, the captain and prison guard Quirt used thinly veiled derogatory language regarding him, specifically referring to Lucas as uppity or boy. Keep that in mind, we're going to come back to that later. When Lucas arrives, Captain Rackham offers him a deal. Become an informant for him, and the time spent in the prison will be easier. Lucas declines the deal, and this is when the captain calls for Quirt to not only lock him in solitary confinement again, but to keep his promise of breaking him. Upon arriving back at the cell, Quirt begins his assault on Lucas. And what can he possibly do? If he retaliates, he's guaranteed to spend the rest of his life behind bars, if not worse. Quirt continues his beating of Lucas while other guards protesting, pleading for this to stop. This is when Quirt responds by saying, "Light's bad here. You guys couldn't see. This creep made a move at me." And when Lucas attempts to respond, Quirt states, "Why, you see that? Stir-crazy punk's trying it again." The assault isn't stopped until Stewart, the new warden, arrives. He announces that Quirt would no longer be employed effective immediately, but before he goes, Lucas can have the opportunity to wish Quirt a goodbye, and subsequently locks them both in the cell unattended. Upon first reading, this scene feels like a cathartic release. I mean, the abusive prison guard lost his job and Lucas was able to get his payback. But when you apply a moment of critical thinking, this scene illustrates why systems of oppression are able to continue operating. For prison guard Quirt, he loses his job. But what stops him from going somewhere else and continuing his form of oppression? While he does experience a beating from Lucas, physical pain is temporary. Why isn't he taken into custody? This leads me to the other prison guards. Why did nobody else stand up to Quirt to stop him? In my opinion, to be complacent is to be complicit. To allow for injustice to happen and you do nothing to stop it is just as bad as you doing it yourself. What the scene shows is a fundamental inequality within the prison system. In theory, prisons are supposed to be rehabilitative and foster a culture of improvement. In practice, prisons are punitive, and they seek to further inequality through the guise of being justified. The impetus of my questioning arose from the following scene displaying Warden Stewart arriving to his office, with Captain Rackham in his chair lamenting to himself of the role that he played in the quote punishment of Lucas. When the warden startles the captain, he isn't immediately detained or even stripped of his authority, but instead told he has a week to prove himself to the warden. Once we catch back up to Lucas, we're immediately introduced to Noah Burstein, the doctor overseeing the medical care for the prison. This provides an opportunity for Lucas to recount to the doctor the events leading up to his imprisonment. Lucas grew up in Harlem, where he and his best friend, Willis Stryker, would work their way up in the criminal underworld. They started at petty theft, but as the gangs began turf wars, they began fighting the rival gangs to no end. Willis was reliant on using throwing knives, while Lucas preferred beating people with his fists. Lucas says that while he lost the appetite for violence, Willis grew accustomed to it, even thrived in his role as a predominant player. Riva was the first person to put them at odds. She was a woman that they both fell in love with, but due to Willis's status, he was able to provide the life for Riva that Lucas never could. Everything was calm until a rival gang cornered Willis and Riva, beating Stryker within an inch of his life. Riva was able to escape and sought out Lucas for help. Lucas came running to the scene and immediately dispatched Willis's attackers, then carrying him off before the police could arrive to the scene. Later, while he was recuperating in a hospital bed, Riva told Willis that she would be leaving him for Lucas. This, of course, was because of her traumatic experience, but to Willis, this was his friend betraying him. Fast forward months later, and the police arrived to Lucas's apartment after receiving a tip, only to find planted narcotics. Lucas knew now that his former ally had turned to his enemy. This is when Lucas was sent to prison and Willis was able to win Riva back. The tragedy comes when Willis is attacked by a rival gang. Riva is shot and killed in the crossfire. After listening to this story, Dr. Burstein offers Lucas an opportunity to volunteer for his new project, and in doing so, could positively impact his outcome for release with the parole board. At first, Lucas refuses because this project could be his death, but when he is confronted with Rackham again, assuring Lucas will, quote, pay for the trouble he caused, Lucas decides that his only option is to accept the doctor's proposition. The doctor describes the project as an electro-biochemical system for stimulating human cell regeneration. If successful, it could counter the damages of almost any disease, perhaps even aging. Lucas hesitantly enters the contraption, and the doctor begins the process. Once started, Lucas exclaims of the pain he's experiencing, but the true danger arises when Rackham appears, dialing up the machine to levels that they were not intended for. Lucas explodes from the contraption and immediately punches Rackham with the force that he believed to be a typical punch, but as a result of his interaction with the experiment, seemingly kills Rackham. Lucas, riddled with guilt, derived from the result of his attempt to defend himself, leading to him accidentally murdering a prison guard, guaranteeing his life in prison, he punches a wall. However, this gesture of expressing his impending doom would then be to his benefit, because this punch would begin to shatter the walls of the prison, leading to his escape. Lucas runs to the edge of the island, but once there, stops for a moment, unsure if he should stand and fight or take the chance with leaping towards freedom. This is the moment when prison guards shoot Lucas multiple times as his body falls into the water and he is presumed dead. Lucas rises from the water, now understanding the extent of his newfound abilities, and decides to return to society, but he can't return under his old identity. He must create a new life for himself, as he seeks to gain his revenge on Willis Stryker for the imprisonment of himself and the death of Riva. This is where Lucas adopts the name Luke Cage, taking on the name Cage as a means to remind himself of his mission, serving as the driving motivation going forward. After stopping a robbery at a storefront and being rewarded by the owner, he decides he will become a hero, but one that would take on jobs requiring someone with his skill set. And you can say that Luke Cage became a hero for hire. When Luke begins busting up Willis's syndicate operation, Willis, now going by the name of Diamondback, makes a call for his men to find Luke Cage and bring him in. This, of course, was Luke's intention. It provided for Luke to gain notoriety for ousting these gang activities, but also getting the attention of Diamondback. After he receives an upgrade to his signature throwing knives by way of poisonous and explosive chemicals, Diamondback decides he will be the one to take out the plague to his operation. Willis tracks this new vigilante to a free clinic that he was seen frequenting and kidnaps the nurse, Claire Temple, to lure Cage to him at a deserted parking garage. When Luke arrives and quickly disposes of Diamondback's goons, Willis makes a break for it. Luke chases after him in hopes of finally gaining revenge against the man who destroyed his life, a man that he had once thought of as a brother. When Diamondback is cornered on a rooftop, he tries to attack with a crowbar, but then witnesses Luke's new abilities firsthand. It's only then that he realizes if he can create enough of a distance between them, he can throw a knife injected with chemicals that would create an explosion, and Willis would rid himself of this ghost of Christmas past. But this doesn't happen. Luke draws closer, and Willis, unaware of his surroundings, starts to stumble back. He wasn't prepared for this unexpected turn, and with his explosive knife out, he falls into a skylight. Once he hits the floor, so too does his knife, which causes an explosion that leads to his assumed death. As Luke looks down from the skylight, he says to himself,
"It's over, Riva, honey. Not quite the way I planned. Willis died by his own knife. Fell in with him. Did this. And if you can't really call that revenge, it's sure some kind of justice."
This ending is bittersweet. It would show to be successful not only for Luke Cage but other characters going forward, but the story never allowed for Luke Cage to independently cause change. In the prison, he beats his abuser, but the actual change comes from the warden. With Diamondback, Luke's able to foil his operations, but Willis was his own undoing. Luke Cage's creation was directly influenced by Shaft, but he lacks the autonomy that's displayed within the Blaxploitation genre. Luke Cage's story is only altered, for better or for worse, by the men surrounding him, and it leaves little room to explore the thematic motif of revenge. Something that I found glaringly obvious during my reading were the allusions to the Tuskegee syphilis experiments. But there's one problem. The public wouldn't be privy to these experiments until 4 months after the first issue of Luke Cage released. The Tuskegee Experiments are an atrocious indictment of the government's treatment of the African American community, and I would be remiss if I didn't at least reference it in this video. Beginning in 1932, the United States Public Health Service, USPHS, sought out to conduct research into biological responses to syphilis if left untreated. They targeted a demographic of 600 black men, 399 of them having the disease, with their control group being 201 without. Over the next 40 years, the USPHS studied these men to see how syphilis would impact their living conditions. The true heinousness of the experiment is that the men were not given the opportunity to provide informed consent, which is scientific research terminology of telling the subjects that they are part of a study. The USPHS operated under the guise of providing free healthcare for these men, effectively indicating that they were deemed by the USPHS to be expendable. Additionally, the USPHS withheld penicillin, which was a method for treatment of syphilis even after becoming widely available. Now, with the proper context, you can probably see why the origin is very close in theme to the government's exploitation and experiments on black bodies. But the creative team had no way of knowing this prior. When he was asked about this, enemy of the show Roy Thomas stated, "Probably no connection unless Archie, Stan, or I had seen earlier reports somewhere, since obviously Hero for Hire #1 was plotted out roughly half a year earlier. We just followed human nature, which is suspect in the best of times, even irrespective of race. The story was about powerful people experimenting on less powerful ones. Race wasn't really a major factor in that part of the plot. Lucas just happened to be the unlucky recipient of the bad guys' attentions because he was in jail. Now, this didn't directly influence his creation, but has retroactively influenced the runs going forward through a thematic lens. I remember reading David F. Walker's 2017 Luke Cage series at the time that it was releasing and noting the subdued illusions throughout. Something that I find fascinating is that both Ultimate Universes bypass this as a part of their depiction of Luke Cage. Maybe it's just them wanting to further differentiate the Ultimate lines from the mainline Marvel Universe, but it is also interesting that Luke Cage is seemingly detached from the historical relevance of his creation. In his place, Marvel has utilized characters like Isaiah Bradley to showcase the inherent discrimination from the US government towards black men. When I first started this script, I wanted to look at the original run of Luke Cage, but as I continued reading, the more the story shifted. In issues going forward, Luke would take odd jobs and occasionally come to a final confrontation that would require his unique abilities. There's even an issue that has Luke Cage go to protect someone in a house that's supposedly haunted, but then the narrative takes a turn into a Scooby-Doo romp. I racked my brain trying to make sense of all of these stories that just lacked cohesion because I wanted to cover Luke Cage through a lens that was interesting. Enter the Ultimates #9. As you're probably already aware, the new Ultimate Universe was established in 2024 spinning out of the Ultimate Invasion miniseries by Jonathan Hickman and Brian Hitch. This new universe would be altered by The Maker, which was Reed Richards of the original Ultimate Universe, designated 1610. The Maker flees captivity in the main Marvel universe and seeks to create a utopia where he controls the forces that are able to stand up to him. If you're interested in watching more great coverage for this universe, I highly recommend watching the videos from both Owen Likes Comics and For Every Kind of Geek. Long story short, the Maker's plan fails for now, and a new team of heroes rises up. They look to set balance to a world that's been plunged into a dystopian nightmare. It's up to the Ultimates, comprised of Iron Lad, Captain America, America Chavez, Thor, Sif, Human Torch, Hawkeye, and She-Hulk, to reach those that had their lives altered. They attempt to distribute the power that the Maker had stolen from them and provide each hero with the right to autonomy of choice. It's their destiny if they choose to accept it. This brings me to the introduction of this Ultimate Universe's iteration of Luke Cage. The Ultimates #9 was written by Deniz Camp and illustrated by Chris Allen. We open with a flashback to February 2009, with a 15-year-old Luke Cage being informed that he was convicted to serve a sentence of 1 year to life. Keep this in mind, we're gonna come back to it. The following pages would intersperse flashbacks from this moment leading up to the modern day. The flashbacks would consist of the abuses undergone while in prison, coupled with the extensive mental and physical fortification of Luke, displaying him either working out or reading political theory. In the current day, 20 years into his sentence, Luke has been relocated to the Gordium Correctional Facility. Luke Cage quickly befriends this universe's Danny Rand, which is the alias for the main Marvel Universe's Iron Fist. Over time, they begin amassing an increasing audience of inmates. Luke speaks regarding the structural inequalities experienced by the prisoners, describing their otherness is by design, stating,
They say it's about justice. They say it's about the law. It's not about any of that shit. It's about power, man.
Luke would go on to illustrate how the guards uphold an unjust system, constructing the imbalance of power and exploit it to provide justification for their cruelty. These snippets of dialogue are presented over a montage sequence of the prisoners experiencing direct abuse by guards and Luke's group beginning to expand further. It then cuts to a flashback of Luke's previous prison where he was met by Iron Lad, presenting him with an ionic catalyst, and going on to explain that the Maker had altered this world to assert his own will, acting as the personification of the structures of power over others. Luke immediately accepts his gift, and he intends to use them. Continuing to the present, he begins to orchestrate a prison break, rallying the prisoners to claim their power as he did. The guards are immediately aware of this attempt, and as a disciplinary measure, are granted the use of lethal force to discourage future attempts. They line up Luke and other inmates for a firing squad and begin firing, but the bullets can't penetrate his bulletproof skin. The following pages continue to alternate between Luke's prison escape in 2024 and now, which I had completely missed upon first reading. Throughout both the siege and the one in the modern day, the prisoners all chant the same phrase, "All power to the people." As Iron Lad presents to Luke, offering him to join the Ultimates and take on the Maker, Luke declines. He elaborates by saying,
Actually, I think I could do more good inside than out because of all I've endured. I know I can't get free until everybody's free.
This is a paraphrase quote from writer, poet, activist, and so much more, Maya Angelou, who stated,
"The truth is, no one of us can be free until everybody is free. And every one of us needs to say to our children, this is your world. Come out, stand out, earn it."
It's then that we return to the modern day with the entirety of the prison seized by the inmates and Luke commanding the charge. Okay, remember whenever I was talking about the oddly specific sentencing for Luke? Well, I didn't forget. Camp went on to Twitter to provide additional context for the inspiration behind this Luke Cage, stating that he was heavily influenced by author and activist George Jackson. Allow me to explain why this is important. In 1971, George Jackson was arrested for armed robbery, where he was attempting to steal $70 from a gas station. Jackson was immediately convicted and sentenced to serve 1 year to life. While incarcerated, Jackson would read through and become enamored with the writings of Karl Marx and Mao Zedong, these both being thought leaders within socialist ideology. Due to the increasing time that he was forced to be in solitary confinement, he began diving into political theory. This is where he would gain further understanding of both societal and foundational inequality. Letters that he would write during this time would go on to be published under the books Blood in My Eye and Soledad Brother. From this time and going forward, Jackson would look to start organizing his fellow inmates. They began rallying in opposition to the abuses experienced by inmates that's also deemed lawful by the state. Keep in mind that this is right in the middle of the civil rights movement, a time where police were actively and savagely brutalizing the African American community while they were provided full backing from the state. George Jackson sought out to improve the living conditions for inmates, making sure that the government was not able to just avoid the abuses that are undertaken by these inmates. For this issue alone, there's a lot to digest. What's made abundantly clear since the first time I read 20th Century Men and even leading up to now is that Deniz Camp is able to infuse his stories with political messaging while also able to humanize these larger than life characters. Not only is this issue a reflection on the prison industrial complex, but it's also a meditation of why we need to dismantle the systems of oppression and how they affect us in the modern day. I did see the criticisms that this issue lacked subtlety or that it painted all prisoners as innocent in a straw man argument regarding the government's treatment and how they're fascistic, and let me provide a subtle response. Just because civil rights were acknowledged does not mean that bigotry stopped. It only shifted into a means to be socially acceptable and palatable while also providing for plausible deniability. The government allows for private businesses to own and operate correctional facilities, and they maintain contracts to make sure that these facilities are profitable. These private companies are financially incentivized to increase the prisoner population. As a result, private industries are able to exploit a loophole in the 13th Amendment that states that while slave labor is illegal, there's an exception for it as a punishment for crime. To put it succinctly, private companies are able to institute mandatory manual labor, resulting in lower wages that need to be paid, while the government subsidizes it. The point of this is to provide an additional nuance to this discussion. As I stated earlier, conceptually, prisons are supposed to be rehabilitative, but in practice, they're meant to be punitive, extracting as much labor at the lower amount that they actually have to pay to these inmates, and they justify it by lumping all prisoners into the same basket, stating that they don't deserve to have the rights of you and me. There's a lack of empathy when people are speaking about inmates in these discussions because of the inherent biases that are ingrained in us by societal norms. No matter the offense, we're conditioned to believe that all inmates are the worst people in the world and that they deserve to be exploited. We're supposed to believe that they're violent or subhuman. We strip them of their humanity so that way we can justify the injustices that they experience on a daily basis. And I'm not okay with that. We can acknowledge that there are wrongdoings by inmates while also being conscious of the fact that these inmates are people and they deserve rehabilitation and not be defined by their worst moments. Comics are political, just as all art is political. That's inarguable. There's been an increase lately of anti-intellectuals that say that all stories are just woke or too political, and instead opting for all of it to be escapism. This is because they see themselves as the ones that are portrayed by villains, and they don't want to think too hard about stories. They would rather have stories that require no insight or analysis, wishing to return to a time where they were unburdened by their own bigotry. I think that's bullshit. All stories are inherently good versus evil, and just because you're not able to interact with or understand the literary devices that are utilized in these stories, it doesn't mean that they're not there. Stories provide for the reader to understand the perspective of the author, and at their best, the world around us. The refusal to interact with stories that are against your own worldview leads to a worldview that is inherently fragile. If you can't challenge your own beliefs, do they really exist? Or are they just simply a castle made of sand? I believe that it's my responsibility as someone with a moderately sized platform to speak on my beliefs. When I began making these videos, I knew that I wanted to make the videos that I would want to watch as a viewer, but I also wanted to make the type of videos that provide an additional perspective beyond those that we see on the page. Now, I'm not saying this as some kind of self-aggrandizing statement, but just a chance to explain why I cover the topics like those that I covered today. Maya Angelou said that one of the things that we need to actually affect change is to have courage. And I think that we all need to look in the mirror and ask ourselves what that means to us and how we can be courageous to make a world that we want to see.